Welcome to the realm of science fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Enjoy listening. George Rhodes had seen things that would haunt most men until their dying days. Cities reduced to smoldering ruins under the relentless reign of orbital fire, civilizations erased as if they had never existed, and wars where death was a mercy compared to the fate of those left behind. He had fought in battles where survival meant enduring horrors that would scar his soul forever. But this was different. This was worse. 2 women knelt before him, their wrists bound in heavy iron cuffs, chains coiled at their feet like the remnants of a broken noose. Their bodies bore the marks of captivity, torn clothing, bruised skin, and the quiet defiance of those who had learned to expect the worst. Standing beside them, savoring the moment, was the Zorith warlord who had orchestrated it all. Kale, a towering figure of muscle encased in dark, segmented armor. His reptilian face twisted into something resembling a grin, jagged teeth gleaming under the dim light of the throne room. His crimson eyes glinted with amusement. A reward, Kale rumbled, his voice thick with mockery, for your service. The words tasted like bile in George's throat. He had fought alongside the Zorith in this war, not out of loyalty, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The enemy they had faced, the Vorith Empire, were planet killers, monsters who wiped out entire species without hesitation. The Zorith at least had a twisted sense of honor, a code, if you could call it that. But this was no different from the slavers George had spent his life hunting. George forced his fists to unclench. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to reach for the knife strapped to his thigh, to put a bullet between Kale's smug eyes. But there were too many of them. A dozen heavily armed warriors lined the chamber, their plasma rifles resting against armored shoulders. If he moved too quickly, this would turn into a bloodbath, one he wouldn't survive, and neither would the women. His gaze flicked to the 2 captives. The first, taller of the 2, had deep indigo skin and sharp angular features. Her silver eyes met his with raw defiance, but there was no fear in them. She knelt because they had forced her to, but her back was straight, her shoulders squared. If freed, she would fight until her last breath. The second woman, smaller but no less striking, had emerald green skin laced with golden markings. She wasn't trembling, but there was a quiet weariness in her gaze, calculating, analyzing, waiting. She wasn't just watching him. She was watching everything, the guards, the exits, the way Kale shifted his weight. She was looking for an opening. They weren't broken. Not yet. You hesitate, Kale drawled, tilting his head. I thought humans had simpler tastes. Take one. They are fine specimens, are they not? George ignored the way his blood burned. He had seen Zorith slave pens before, the screams, the smell of scorched flesh, the endless corridors of locked cells filled with those who had already given up. He had seen what happened to those who weren't chosen. His stomach twisted. Choose, Kale said, amusement creeping into his voice. Or I will choose for you. George exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Then he moved, not for a weapon but for something else. His hand went to his belt, and in a single fluid motion he drew his combat knife, its black steel gleaming under the flickering light. Gasps filled the chamber as he knelt, not before Kale, not in submission, but in front of the women. The indigo-skinned woman stiffened as the cold metal of the blade touched her wrist. For a split second, George saw her brace for pain, for betrayal. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the blade sliced through her chains. The cuffs fell away with a metallic clang. George shifted immediately, cutting through the emerald-skinned woman's bonds before anyone could react. Kale's expression shifted from amusement to fury. You. I choose neither, George said, rising to his feet, knife still in hand. I choose their freedom. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The indigo-skinned woman rubbed her freed wrists, her expression unreadable. The emerald-skinned woman blinked once, her golden eyes flicking between George and Kale, still processing what had just happened. Kale exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was almost impressed. You insult me, human. No, George said, I'm showing you mercy. For a single, stretched-out moment, no one moved. The guards gripped their weapons, tension thick enough to snap. Then Kale smiled, a slow, dangerous thing. "You are a fool," he murmured, "and now you die." The first guard lifted his rifle. The indigo-skinned woman was already moving. The emerald-skinned woman followed a second later. George didn't have time to think. He grabbed the emerald-skinned woman by the wrist and yanked her behind him as the indigo-skinned woman lunged, her bare hands wrapping around the nearest guard's weapon. A brutal twist, a sickening crack, and suddenly she was armed. The chamber exploded into chaos. George fired his sidearm, dropping a Zorith warrior before he could raise his plasma rifle. The indigo-skinned woman ducked beneath another's swing, driving the butt of her stolen weapon into his throat. The emerald-skinned woman moved fast, her smaller frame darting between armored giants, her hands moving with deadly precision as she seized a fallen knife. Kale roared, reaching for the massive blade at his waist. "Go!" George barked. "Now!" They ran. Smoke filled the air as plasma bolts tore through the chamber walls, sending shards of stone raining down around them. The indigo-skinned woman was at his side, the emerald-skinned woman just behind, their footfalls echoing against the cold metal floors. George didn't look back. They had seconds, maybe less, before the full weight of the warlord's fury came crashing down on them. And when it did, there wouldn't be anywhere left to run. But that was a problem for later. Right now, they had to survive. The jungle swallowed them whole. George Rhodes sprinted through the undergrowth, his breath sharp, his pulse hammering in his ears. Behind him, the indigo-skinned woman, Kayla, and the emerald-skinned woman, Lyra, moved like ghosts, silent despite their speed. The moment they'd escaped the Zorith stronghold, they had hit the tree-line at full force, the darkness of the jungle their only salvation. Plasma bolts hissed through the air, scorching bark and slicing through the thick canopy above. The Zorith were relentless. Heavy reptilian bodies crashed through the underbrush, their guttural snarls and bellowed commands, sending birds shrieking into the sky. The hunt was on. George barely ducked in time as a bolt seared past his head, heat licking at his skin. They were too exposed. They needed cover, needed time. Up ahead, the jungle thickened, the trees growing denser, the foliage nearly impenetrable. It was their best shot. He pivoted sharply. There. Kayla was already ahead of him, her long stride carrying her forward with a warrior's grace. Lyra followed close behind, her smaller frame moving with an uncanny quickness, her golden eyes flicking toward every shadow, every shifting branch. George forced his burning legs to keep moving. The uneven terrain threatened to trip him with every step, exposed roots, tangled vines, jagged rocks hidden beneath the ferns. But stopping meant death. The roar of plasma fire faded behind them, replaced by the steady hum of the jungle. The further they ran, the thicker the air became, damp with humidity, filled with the scent of earth and rain. The jungle was alive, chittering insects, unseen predators rustling in the brush, distant howls carried on the wind. After what felt like an eternity, they broke into a small clearing. A fallen tree, massive and ancient, lay across the space, its roots jutting upward like skeletal fingers, a natural barricade. George vaulted over it first, landing hard and rolling onto his feet. Kayla followed without hesitation, moving like a shadow. Lyra hesitated for half a second. Then she was over, landing smoothly beside them. Silence. George whispered, crouching and catching his breath. His pulse still hammered, his body screaming at him. Every muscle burned. He pressed a hand against his ribs, feeling the sharp twinge of what was likely a bruise forming. Kayla was already scanning the jungle, her sharp silver eyes narrowing. "They won't stop," she murmured. "Not until they find us." "Then we make sure they don't," George said, forcing himself to focus. He turned to Lyra, who was kneeling beside the fallen tree, running her fingers across the moss-covered bark. "Lyra." She didn't look up. "Water's close." George frowned, following her gaze. The ground sloped downward just beyond the tree, and now that he was listening, really listening, he could hear it. A faint but steady sound. Moving water. A river. George exhaled. Good. That's our way out. Kayla was already shaking her head. It's too exposed. If they follow us, they'll pick us off the second we hit open water. Lyra met her gaze. They'll follow us anywhere. At least this way, we control the distance. Kayla didn't argue. She didn't like it, but she knew Lyra was right. George pushed himself upright. Let's move. They stayed low, slipping through the foliage like ghosts. The jungle pressed in around them, every shifting shadow a potential threat, every snapped twig an alarm waiting to be triggered. The air was thick, humid, heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. The river came into view a few minutes later, a dark ribbon of water cutting through the jungle, its surface rippling with unseen currents. It was deeper than George had hoped, faster than he would have liked, but it would have to do. We swim, he said. Lyra was already moving, stepping into the water without hesitation. Kayla hesitated just for a moment before following. George took one last look at the jungle behind them. No movement, no sound. But he knew better than to believe they had lost the Zorith. Not yet. Then he stepped into the river. The cold shock of the water stole the breath from his lungs. He dove beneath the surface, the world above vanishing into silence. The river had saved them, but it had done so cruelly. George Rhodes's body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. His lungs burned as he dragged himself onto the muddy riverbank, coughing out the last remnants of water from his throat. His fingers dug into the wet earth, grasping at something solid, anything to remind himself that he was still alive. Kayla emerged next, pulling herself up with the grace of someone who refused to be defeated. Water streamed from her indigo skin, her silver eyes scanning the jungle before she even fully caught her breath. Always alert, always ready. Lyra followed moments later, her smaller frame trembling slightly as she gripped a tangle of exposed roots and pulled herself up. She knelt there for a second, panting, her golden-marked skin slick with river water, her usually sharp gaze unfocused. None of them spoke. The jungle around them hummed with life, the chirping of unseen insects, the distant screeches of nocturnal predators, the slow rustling of the wind through thick foliage. But what mattered most was what wasn't there. No shouting Zorith warriors. No distant hum of pursuit drones. No telltale whine of plasma weapons cutting through the humid air. They had lost them, at least for now. George sat back against the damp earth, closing his eyes for just a second, feeling the deep ache settling into his limbs. His ribs throbbed from where he'd slammed into a rock underwater. His legs felt like dead weight, but he forced himself upright. Pain was secondary. Survival came first. Kayla wiped a hand down her face, exhaling sharply. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice still breathless. "They won't give up that easily." George nodded, but his mind was already working through the problem. "We'll move," he said, his voice hoarse. "But not yet. We need to figure out where the hell we are first." Lyra was still kneeling, gripping her arms as if trying to steady herself. Her golden eyes flicked up toward the jungle, unfocused for a moment before narrowing. "I saw mountains before we hit the water," she murmured. "If we reach higher ground, we'll have the advantage." Kayla gave a low, humorless chuckle. "Higher ground also makes us visible. Staying here makes us dead." Lyra shot back, sharper this time. "Staying here makes us dead faster." George wiped a hand over his face. He didn't have the energy for arguing. "We move," he decided. "Slow. Quiet. The Zorith will expect us to run blind. We won't give them the satisfaction." Kayla gave a curt nod. Lyra just exhaled and pushed herself to her feet. They slipped into the jungle like ghosts. The terrain was unforgiving. The damp soil sucked at their boots, vines coiled around their arms like grasping fingers, and unseen creatures scuttled in the darkness just beyond their vision. The air was thick with moisture, the scent of rain and earth clinging to them. George kept his ears sharp, listening for anything that didn't belong, a snapped branch, the whir of a drone, the low murmur of alien voices. But all he heard was the jungle itself, alive and indifferent to their suffering. They moved in silence, instinctively keeping a staggered formation. Kayla ahead, George in the middle, Lyra covering the rear. It wasn't something they had discussed, but it happened naturally. Kayla was the fighter, the one who would take the first strike. Lyra was the observer, the one who saw danger before it came. George, he was somewhere in between. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. A massive fallen tree lay at the center, its thick roots jutting into the air like skeletal fingers. It provided just enough cover to be useful. George gestured toward it. "We stop here. 10 minutes. No fire." Kayla crouched by the edge of the clearing, scanning the darkness beyond. Lyra didn't even hesitate before sinking down against the tree, her breath still unsteady. George exhaled and leaned against the rough bark, rubbing at his shoulder. The exhaustion was settling deep now, curling into his muscles, making every movement feel like wading through quicksand. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lyra broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" George turned his head toward her. She was watching him, her golden eyes unreadable in the dim light. She didn't clarify, but she didn't need to. "Why did you free us? Why didn't you choose one of us like they wanted? Why didn't you run?" George exhaled slowly, running a hand through his still wet hair. He should have expected the question. "I've seen what happens to people in chains," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I wasn't going to let that happen again." Kayla, who had been silent until now, flicked her gaze toward him. "You've seen it before." George hesitated. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "When I was 19, I was part of a crew that raided a slaver outpost," he said, keeping his voice even. "We thought we were doing something good. Thought we were saving people." A bitter chuckle escaped him. "We were wrong. Another crew hit the outpost the same night. No coordination, no plan, just chaos. The slavers panicked, started killing prisoners before anyone could reach them." He didn't look at them as he spoke. He didn't have to. By the time we got inside, half of them were already dead. Silence. The jungle hummed around them, alive, but none of them moved. Lyra swallowed. "And the rest?" George finally met her gaze. "The ones we saved," his lips pressed into a thin line. "They were grateful. But you could still see it in their eyes, that knowledge that no matter how far they ran, how free they were, something had been taken from them that they would never get back." Kayla's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her silver eyes, a quiet understanding. "We're not them," she said, her voice softer than he had expected. George let out a slow breath. "No," he said, "you're not." He leaned back against the tree, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on them. He didn't trust easily, never had, but as he glanced between Kayla and Lyra, he realized something. He wanted to, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The night was thick with the weight of exhaustion, but none of them could sleep. The jungle loomed around them, vast and indifferent, its dense canopy cutting out the sky. A storm was coming. George could smell it in the air, feel the shifting pressure pressing against his skull. It would rain soon, and when it did, the Zorith search would grow harder. The downpour would wash away their footprints, mask their scent. They just had to last until morning. George sat with his back against the massive fallen tree, his sidearm resting loosely in his grip. But his focus wasn't on the weapon. It was on the two alien women who had only hours ago been nothing more than strangers with shackles around their wrists. Now, things were different. Kayla crouched a few feet away, her body tense, silver eyes sharp and watchful. She had barely spoken since they had escaped. But even in silence, she was a presence that couldn't be ignored. She was a warrior through and through, strong, resilient. She wore her defiance like armor, her hatred for the Zorith burning just beneath the surface. Lyra sat cross-legged near the base of the tree, her smaller frame wrapped in the damp remains of her tunic, golden markings glistening faintly under the faint moonlight, filtering through the leaves. Where Kayla was rigid, Lyra was still, but not weak. She didn't fidget, didn't tremble. She was a quiet observer, always thinking, always calculating. They weren't like anyone he had met before. George exhaled, rolling his sore shoulder before shifting his attention to them. "We should at least know each other's names before we end up dying in the same ditch, he muttered. Kayla's sharp gaze flicked to him, unreadable. Lyra raised an eyebrow. That's optimistic. George smirked. I'm known for it. A brief pause, then after a moment Kayla said, Kayla. No embellishments, no hesitation, just her name, given like a statement of fact. Lyra glanced at her, then at George. Lyra. George gave a slow nod. George Rhodes. The names settled between them, solidifying something unspoken. They weren't allies yet, not really, but they weren't strangers anymore either. The moment didn't last long. A distant howl cut through the night, deep and guttural. Something was hunting. Kayla tensed instantly, fingers curling into fists. Lyra turned her head slightly, listening. George sighed. I was hoping for at least 10 minutes of peace. Kayla didn't look away from the darkness beyond the clearing. Hope is a weakness. George tilted his head, watching her. Hope is why you're still alive. She didn't respond. Lyra stood up, stretching. We should move soon. If that storm rolls in, we'll have an advantage, but not if we wait too long. George agreed, but his body had other plans. The moment he tried to stand, a sharp pain flared in his ribs, and he let out a low grunt. He barely reacted in time when Lyra was suddenly there, pressing 2 fingers against his side, just below the injured area. He stiffened at the touch, but she didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Bruised, she murmured, her voice clinical. Possibly cracked. Not bad enough to slow you down, but bad enough to get worse if you're careless. George arched an eyebrow. You a doctor? Lyra glanced up at him, her golden eyes catching the dim light. Something like that. Kayla was watching the exchange, her silver gaze unreadable. George exhaled sharply, but let Lyra press against another spot along his ribs, testing. Her hands were smaller than his, but strong, steady. He didn't remember the last time someone had touched him like this, not with violence, not with cold medical detachment, but something in between. Then Lyra paused, tilting her head slightly. You tense every time I touch here, she noted. George gave her a half smirk. Maybe I just like the attention. Lyra blinked. Then, to his surprise, she let out a quiet huff of amusement. Kayla rolled her eyes. Humans are insufferable. George chuckled, wincing slightly. You just figuring that out? The atmosphere shifted, not by much, but enough. Something unspoken passed between them, something heavier than words. George wasn't an idiot. He had seen the way Kayla watched him, how her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. He had felt the way Lyra moved closer, without even realizing it, drawn by something she probably didn't fully understand yet. And he wasn't blind to himself, either. They were different, but something about them pulled at him in a way he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he was damn sure that whatever this was, it had already started. The jungle was restless that night. The storm had passed, leaving behind damp earth and a sky smeared with remnants of lightning. But the tension in the air hadn't broken. It clung to them, thick and suffocating, as if the very trees were holding their breath. George Rhodes sat near the faint embers of their fire, sharpening his knife more out of habit than necessity. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone was the only sound between them, aside from the occasional rustle of unseen creatures shifting in the undergrowth. Kayla stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her back rigid. Her indigo skin caught the flickering light, casting deep shadows across her sharp features. She hadn't spoken in a while, not since they had stopped for the night. She hadn't needed to. Lyra sat on the opposite side of the fire, her golden eyes reflecting the dim glow. Her emerald-green skin still glistened from the rain. She wasn't watching George, she was watching Kayla, quiet, patient, waiting. Something was coming. George could feel it in the way Kayla's shoulders tensed, in the way her silver eyes flicked toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. She was on the verge of something. And then, without warning, she spoke. You love her. Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something frayed at the edges. George looked up, blinking. What? Kayla's arms tightened across her chest. Lyra, she said, as if clarifying something obvious. You love her. George exhaled slowly, setting the knife down. And that's a problem because Kayla's jaw clenched. She was silent for a moment, staring at the fire as if the words she needed were buried in the embers. Then she turned away, her shoulders tense, her whole body wound tight, like a coiled wire. She hesitated, her voice faltering. I can't do this. George pushed himself up, ignoring the ache in his ribs. He stepped toward her carefully, but she didn't turn to face him. Kayla, I don't know how the words came out sharper than she had probably intended, but there was no taking them back now. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Then, finally, she turned, her silver eyes locking onto his. I don't know how to trust this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. How to trust you? George stilled. Kayla had never been one to admit weakness. She wore her strength like armor, kept her emotions locked behind iron walls. But now, standing there in the dim firelight, her indigo skin shimmering with the remnants of rain, she looked different, not weak, just tired. George's grip loosened, his fingers brushing against his side where his knife usually rested. He wanted to reach for her, but he didn't, not yet. You don't have to know how, he said softly. That's not how this works. Kayla let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You make it sound so easy. It's not, he admitted, but running doesn't make it easier. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. I'm not running. George tilted his head slightly. Aren't you? Kayla's breath hitched, just barely, but he caught it. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Lyra, who had been silent this whole time, finally stood. She stepped forward, her golden gaze shifting between them, assessing, considering. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against Kayla's wrist, just a whisper of contact, the barest suggestion of touch. Kayla tensed, but she didn't pull away. Lyra's voice was quiet but steady. Not everything ends in loss. Kayla's breath was uneven now, her posture wavering, as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. George took a step closer, his voice softer now. Let us show you. Kayla didn't move, didn't speak, but she didn't step away either. And for now, that was enough. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow against the damp jungle floor. The scent of wet earth, charred wood, and the lingering metallic tang of ozone from the earlier storm filled the air. Beyond their small clearing, the jungle pulsed with distant sounds, creatures stirring in the undergrowth, water dripping from thick leaves, the hushed rhythm of a world indifferent to their struggles. George Rhodes sat on the ground, one knee bent, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel against stone was steady, methodical, a small attempt to ground himself in something tangible. Across from him, Lyra leaned back against the base of a massive, gnarled tree, her golden eyes half-lidded, thoughtful. The rain had left her emerald-green skin damp, her golden markings gleaming faintly in the firelight. She looked calm, but George knew better. Kayla stood at the edge of the clearing, her back partially turned to them. The faint light caught on the curves of her indigo skin, illuminating the sharp angles of her shoulders, the tension in the way she held herself. She hadn't spoken much since their argument, hadn't met his gaze since the moment she admitted she didn't know how to trust. George had given her space, waiting for her to work through whatever storm was raging inside her. But she was still there. That had to mean something. The quiet stretched between them, heavy and thick. Then, finally, Kayla exhaled sharply and turned, crossing her arms. This is a mistake, she muttered. George arched an eyebrow, pausing mid-stroke with his knife. Going to have to be more specific. Kayla's silver eyes flicked toward him, full of something unreadable. This, all of it, you, me. She hesitated, then shot a look toward Lyra. Her. Lyra didn't react, but George caught the slight shift in her expression, a flicker of something deep in those golden eyes. Kayla shook her head. It's dangerous. George let out a slow breath, setting the knife down. You're not wrong. Kayla blinked, as if she had expected him to argue. This is dangerous, George continued, leaning back on his palms. We're in the middle of a jungle, running from a species that would rather see us dead than free. We're probably outnumbered, outgunned, and low on supplies. His lips curled into a humorless smirk. If you're just now realizing that, I'm worried about you. Kayla's jaw tightened. That's not what I meant. George already knew that. He tilted his head slightly. Then say what you do mean. Kayla's fingers curled into fists. She let out a frustrated breath, looking away. You don't understand. Lyra finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Then explain it to us. Kayla stiffened. For a moment, George thought she would walk away, disappear into the jungle, and let this conversation drown in silence. But then she turned back, silver eyes sharp with something almost desperate. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to trust this. How to trust you? Something tightened in George's chest. Kayla was a fighter, a survivor. She had spent her life relying on herself, never allowing herself to need anyone. But here she was, standing in front of him, admitting something he suspected she had never admitted to anyone before. I don't know how to let myself feel this, she said, quieter now, because every time I've let someone in, I've lost them. Lyra sat forward slightly, watching her closely. You think if you don't let it happen, you can't lose it. Kayla's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I know it. The words hung between them. George exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He could feel the weight behind what she was saying, the years of loss and survival carved into every syllable. Kayla, he said carefully, I can't promise you that this ends well. I can't promise that we make it out of this alive, or that we don't lose people along the way. He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. But I can promise you that if you keep running from it, you're already losing something. Kayla didn't answer, didn't look away. And that was when George knew he had finally gotten to her. Lyra shifted slightly, standing up. She moved toward Kayla, not aggressively, not quickly, just close enough that the space between them grew smaller. I don't believe in fate, Lyra murmured, but I believe in choice. Kayla tensed as Lyra reached out, fingertips barely brushing against her wrist, a test, a question. Kayla didn't move, didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into it either. Lyra's golden eyes softened. Not everything ends in loss. George watched as something cracked in Kayla's expression, not broken, just enough to let the light in. Kayla closed her eyes for a brief second, as if steadying herself. When she opened them, she exhaled shakily. She looked at Lyra first, then at George. She didn't speak, but she stayed. And for now, that was enough.